Hey there. Welcome to another edition of Cambridge Inside Out. I'm Robert Winters.
And I'm Judy Nathans.
And today's June 26, 2018.
Yeah, it's already summer.
It's already summer.
It's going to be real summer this weekend.
Actually, there was some of the forecasts were saying that we could break 100. The early forecasts I don't think are going to come true, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, they said along the coast may be different, but the real issue is the humidity. That's what gets me. It's not the temperature, it's the humidity. It's going to be really muggy.
Well, I think it was several days ago the forecasts were basically saying it could go up to record-breaking 106 or something.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah,
really?
I haven't seen it that way. I haven't seen it break 100 yet, so anyway, it's summer.
Air conditioning. Watch soccer. Whatever.
Yeah, and maybe one of these days I'll actually be able to support air conditioning in my house.
Oh, because you couldn't.
That's
it's
true.
not a philosophical thing. It's
it was electrical power.
Infrastructure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
All
that
right.
actually may be changing right as we sit
yeah,
here.
Yeah, I know. You're getting your electrical
They're switching
work
to
done.
service right now.
Good
actually.
for you. Good
so,
for you. I can't believe you've lived without any kind of air conditioning. You've got room air conditioning, no?
Nope.
Oh my God.
Nope. No, I have fans.
Whoa. All right. Let's go on.
Right, yeah. So with the end of June also comes the end of the city council regular term, but the season.
Yeah, they break for summer recess.
They go for summer recess, which is like all the kids. And
they have one meeting during the summer, so they're basically off for 2 months.
Yeah, so I think it's July 30th.
30th, it is
the midsummer meeting.
July 30th.
Which they often hold at the over at the school committee room because it's air conditioned.
And is that where it is going to be?
Probably. We'll see. I haven't
that
actually
is
looked at the schedule.
That can be televised though, right?
They have
television.
everything for that. Sure.
Right.
So the city council actually had their last regular meeting for
which was
the
very
spring.
short. I thought somehow it would go longer. But
there's kind of a weird way these things work. Where sometimes I'll tell you. Here's a few things that almost always happen.
Okay.
So. And it's a little bit different in municipal election years and non-municipal election years.
True.
There is some
good
people
point.
think there's an advantage in submitting zoning petitions right around this time of year because then you pop them in. It's funny because a year ago people were saying like, oh yeah, the evil developers, they're sneaking it in here right before the summer.
Well, also with the election year too.
Right.
Year, yeah.
They'll sneak it in right before the summertime.
So people forget about it?
So that everybody will be away, and then they'll sneak it through. And then I pointed out that if that's true, then how does that explain that most of the petitions that have been filed in the late spring were actually citizens' petitions?
Yeah.
They weren't filed by the evil developers.
That's true. There's only one I think that is a developer that's on the docket here.
Let's see. So
we'll go over that.
Yeah. So that was one of the items on the agenda. Actually, we'll just say a quick thing about the zoning first. So maybe we should want to get into a little more of the details in a bit. But basically, there's just been rather strangely just one zoning petition all year.
You mean from anybody?
Anybody. There was one that got dismissed at the end of the year. It was the Crone petition having to do with Harvard Square.
Right.
And then that one day probably will return in some variation.
Okay.
Then in came in late April was the one from Mike Nakagawa and Doug Brown, which is
what is now also. That's the same one, right?
That's the sort of one that's really
which was
before.
about alewife and climate protection and all that.
Yeah, I mean it's a curious petition in that certainly my way of evaluating these things, I would say it's really two petitions.
Okay.
There's one that's very specific to the alewife district. And in some ways is derived, at least in part, from some of the ideas that were bubbling up from the Envision Cambridge Alewife Working Group. Though not entirely, because it actually deviates from that in some significant ways as well.
That's a bad word to use. Anyway.
Right. Well, I mean, there are some significant deviations. And then there's the other part, which is actually a citywide overlay. That's supposedly
affordable housing? Is that
not related. So this is related to potential flooding.
Oh, okay, that's what you're talking about.
Very long term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And I was reading some of the statistics within the report to the planning board, which will be their meeting is tonight at 6:30.
You're going to that?
Is the hearing? I may have dropped by that.
It's on your way home.
Yeah, but the thing is, it's sort of I think this is be one of those ones where all the troops are called out, so it'll be a packed meeting,
Yeah.
and it'll be sort of the usual people kind of reading, sort
Do
of
they
reciting
meet every
the thing.
week?
Not every week. The planning board is like the hardest working committee in
I
the
was gonna
city.
say, they really should get paid.
I don't
I'm
know-
sorry.
I don't
They
know
should get
that-
something.
I don't know that the
Just-
payment would necessarily compensate them appropriately, because
True.
it's really their time, and
Well-
the money isn't really so much the issue for most of them.
Okay,
Um,
but then why do they do it then? It does involve a lot
Good
of time,
citizens.
a lot of, I guess,
Good
but that's
citizens,
more
yeah.
so than I think any commission or any, seem
Ye-
to have more responsibility.
Yeah, but the thing is out of a city of what's the population up to now? I think
100,000, I don't know,
it's-
110, I don't,
it was like, it had been like 108, and then the latest one puts it up probably close to 115 or something.
oh, wow, okay,
It was a big jump, but then people are starting to move into all the housing that was getting built, I suppose.
true.
But and I don't know how accurate the number is, because I think there's a lot of vacant units that are getting counted in there as people, but
Maybe.
who knows? I mean, it's an estimate
We'll
anyway.
see what the census says.
Yeah, but anyway, what was I saying about that?
Okay, you were talking about the cities, ooh.
Oh yeah, if
right.
you have 115,000 people, and the planning board consists of about
Planning.
7, I think you can find 7 people out of
That
115,000
dedicated, really
who are
wanna
willing
get
to
into
do it. And
the weeds like that,
so
okay.
the numbers are kind of work in our favor,
All right.
and there's very good people who are on the planning
Good.
board. So anyway, the Nakagawa Brown petition is sort of the big subject before them tonight, and we'll see where it goes. I mean, the thing is, this is one of those ones that's so overarching
Yeah,
and multifaceted that it's liable to take multiple planning board
and
hearings.
there's some legal stuff involved, yes? No?
Yeah, well, I think actually the biggest problem with any zoning petition, and I'm not doing this to knock this one in particular, it's that the planning board and the staff are always mindful of to what degree does a new zoning petition put a lot of existing properties into non-conformity.
Good point.
And this one puts a lot
Oh,
of
really?
properties into non-conformity.
But don't they get grandfathered in?
You
Or
get
no?
grandfathered in right up to the point where you want to do a mildly substantial bit of work to your property.
Oh, and then you have to do something special.
Yeah, and I forget what the dollar. I think they do key it by a dollar figure. But if you're doing a somewhat renovation project, you might have to then abide by the new restrictions.
Okay,
And not to get too into the weeds here, but this petition, if you read it just verbatim, it
have
says.
you done that? Of course you have.
Yes, and I've also read the reports from the staff to the
That
planning
goes
board.
beyond my,
At
I
your
just
pay
can't-
grade?
yeah,
Yeah,
I just rely on you.
Well, the one thing what I find interesting is that, and I'm kind of reminded, we had relatives in New Jersey, I think when I was a kid, where they lived down close to the shore and their house was up on stilts.
Oh, back then?
Yeah.
It's probably gone now.
Oh, probably got washed away long ago, right?
Wow.
But the thing
Yeah.
is that one of the provisions in this petition actually says for both, not only for alewife, but basically for the whole overlay, would actually say you can't have residences on the first floors. They have to be second floor and above, because hey, things
Yeah.
might flood, right?
Sure.
And also you can't do storage of fuels, which means you probably can't park
Right.
cars on underground parking
And
garages.
what about utilities and
Right,
oil
so they
tanks
would
and
have to
that
all be
stuff,
elevated
yeah.
too. So now I think maybe we can all agree on the elevation of some of the utilities, but the thing is the city's trend over the last, I don't know, 30 years has been toward moving surface parking lots underground. And if you read this petition verbatim, it makes it seem as though the only parking garage you could have underground would be one where there were no cars in it, because there's fuel stored in cars.
Well, I mean, but aren't there parking garage, I mean, Alewife has some parking garages that are tall.
So you could have
right?
elevated parking garages
People
then,
don't wanna look
right?
at, but,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. So, but the thing is some of the most specific recommendations in what the Envision Cambridge processes come up with so far, not just for alewife, but actually citywide, is they really talk about on the corridors and in the major squares
Yeah.
and in alewife, actually creating a real full streetscape where there's a lot of more interaction of the people on the ground with the storefronts and whatever. And if everything is basically supposed to be elevated up,
Yeah.
it kind of goes against some of those recommendations. So it may be said that some of these ideas that are climate specific may be in sync with some of what Envision Cambridge was coming out with, but some of the ones about urban form are very much in conflict. So that translates, as far as I can see, into the planning board having some questions and probably spending multiple hearings working their way through the details
Okay,
of this.
so I'm being a little ignorant here. Does that petition apply to all of Cambridge or just that area?
It
Are they
applies to, yeah, actually it's interesting, the most zoning in Cambridge,
Yeah.
almost all, you basically delineate, you say you're in a residence C1 district or a
Okay.
business
Yeah.
B district or BA1 or whatever. And within districts that are fixed, geographically fixed, you lay out what uses are allowed and what sort of
Okay.
restrictions are required, et cetera, et cetera. This one's unusual in that what it does is it says that the zones, these sort of flood-prone zones, would be defined by maps that will change over time, and basically they are simply referred to.
So the zoning then is in flux?
The zoning basically varies with the maps. So if somebody collects new data and says that the 100-year floodplain zone is now delineated in this way, then your house might have been conforming at one time, but then when they update the maps, it becomes non-conforming.
That's not, you can't then project, you can't build on that notion that it might change.
Well, it's a bit squishy,
Yeah.
to say the least.
Well, either you just say you can't build certain kinds of things, period, in certain floodplains. Can't
Right,
they do that?
but it's a matter of what do you define to be the floodplain, right?
And that's in question?
It is a bit question. Actually, all of the city's projections say one thing,
Well,
whereas
actually, I'd say Boston will be underwater in
right,
60
but
years.
the petitioner's projections suggest something else. So,
Oh, okay, so they're gonna have to bring in some science-oriented stuff here, or what?
yeah, but it's it's kind of new ground for that. But
Yeah.
But anyway, that's just sort of
Okay.
now. I think I saw if I read it correctly, they say that currently the percentage of properties that are currently non-conforming based on the existing kind of flood-prone areas was sort of in the range of about 2%. And this would jump it up to, I could be getting this number wrong, I have it around here somewhere, but it could jump up to like 46%.
That's crazy.
Something like that. Yeah, so it was something really kind of a gigantic leap.
Okay.
And again, maybe.
So what is this that you're referring, was this an
This is the-
initial report?
These are the reports from the planning
Oh,
board
so they already
to the planning board. So they'll probably discuss that tonight.
Oh, it's to the planning board,
Yeah.
and then please
And I don't
comment on
remember the
this.
exact
Okay.
numbers here right now, but the
All
thing
right.
is that it was, I mean, you could actually potentially affect up to, I think, and one of the numbers was 63%
That's
of
crazy.
land area in the city, and 70% of all parcels in the city. So it's it's a big, deep reach.
It is.
Now, depending on your point of view, I mean, there's a lot of people who are very alarmed about climate change.
Yeah.
And
As we should be.
Well, people should certainly be aware.
Yeah.
People should plan accordingly.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that alarm is really the best way
Well,
to
you
make
need to plan
decisions.
now. True.
Plan,
I mean,
yeah, plan.
Whether this is a good solution
Right.
is another story.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll sort of see how it shakes out. But the thing is, it's got a lot
It's
of.
gonna be hard to watch or listen to because it sounds gonna be
Yeah.
very technical and oh my gosh.
There's one other aspect to this
Yeah.
that I can't get away from, only because I've been watching these things
Yeah.
for so many years, which is that, I look at the players, the people who actually file the petitions,
Right.
the people who are being vocally supportive of petitions, and then I go back and I think about petitions that were filed some years ago,
Yeah.
and even petitions that were filed 20 years ago, and I see some of the same names.
Really?
Yes, and when I look at that, what I think is, okay, there are people who want certain outcomes, and they may not be successful when they file petitions or try and elect people to go and achieve the ends that they want.
Yeah.
So they try something else, and then that doesn't work, and they try something else, and they try something else. So, back in the 1990s, and again, I'm not coming to saying yay or nay on this
Yeah.
petition. I'm just saying is that there is kind of a pattern here.
Well, you keep trying.
Well,
Come back and keep trying.
well,
no?
but the thing is, so back in 1990s, or actually even earlier, it was the Cambridge Citizens for Livable Neighborhoods had had certain goals and standards. They basically didn't want development. And then there was the group that called itself the Cambridge Residents for Growth Management, and they were all about downzoning, right? Because they wanted to curtail development, right? And then there was some success in that. There was some properties that were downzoned, and then actually in relatively recent years, what you've seen is there's been a flurry of little miniature upzoning petitions, largely restoring some of the higher density in areas that had been downzoned in the previous round. Okay. Back in around 2013, maybe even sooner, that was the period when you had the people were getting very worked up about the city has no master plan, and it was this this drumbeat about the city has no plan that actually led to Envision Cambridge. And I think that the desired outcome of those who brought that forward was primarily to curtail development. Now, maybe that's good, maybe that's not so good, but I think that's kind of what they wanted.
Maybe.
Maybe I overstated a bit, but
I think so.
when I say that, basically it was people who didn't like the traffic on Freshman Parkway. And
Who does?
Well, who does, right?
It's even worse. I was out there today, and I can't believe it.
Right. So the traffic, to be overly simple-minded about it, the traffic on Freshman Parkway begat the Envision Cambridge, and now the Envision Cambridge spins off these working groups, and from that now we have a zoning petition that borrows from some of that, specific to the alewife, and then also citywide. When I look at the players, I can't help but think that at least a little piece of the motivation behind this is not just about climate. It's also about putting in
development.
Yeah, and putting in more stringent requirements so that less would be buildable. And the report to the planning board pretty much acknowledges that. It says if you require setbacks, that are far set back from the street, or you put in far more greater open space requirements, or then you're basically saying you can't build as much, right?
But you could build up.
You can build up, and actually the one thing that's a little bit different about this, and maybe to some would be somewhat unexpected, is that I think to win over the hearts and minds of some of the pro-housing groups, they basically said, okay, we're not that bad on town height, we're okay with some additional height, we're okay with a little density, but what we're going to do is we're going to put our restrictions on mandating a fair amount of open space and permeable ground. Now the problem is that we said this before, even if there wasn't a stick of building built on the alewife plain, it was not ever going to be very permeable.
Yeah.
So it's not a wetland area. It's basically
It's not.
no. It's basically it's clay base. Okay. The problem there is that when it does flood, it doesn't absorb. It has to be conveyed away. So that's what the job of the Alewife Brook and the Mystic River is to convey it away. And that's helped along by pumps at the Amelia Earhart Dam. It's over the years that the ability to convey water away has been restricted by basically culverts under roads that are too narrow, other obstructions, even the narrowing of the Alewife Brook. But the problem is not so much the ability for water to percolate into the soil there. It's always been really an issue of how the hell do you get the water out of there. And in the short term, how do you store it?
Okay, so is it going to come up to the same problem that was here, or is it a different problem? Because
At Mass and Main?
Yeah, where they're building an underground storage.
Yeah. Actually, the truth is that even without this petition, the city passed a flood overlay zone some years ago.
Yeah.
And it is actually
So
pretty stringent now, and they have been for a good while. So to some degree, this is sort of an add-on top of what already exists.
Okay.
Basically, the rule is now that if you want to build a building in many places in Cambridge, any place that's subject to flooding, you have to put in compensatory flood storage. And in fact, by the time your project is done, it has to handle stormwater better than before you built the building.
I think I actually heard that in response to this initially, so that there is stuff in place. Okay.
Yeah, there's very much stuff in place. So it's a matter of, well, do you need a kind of more of an emergency level of
Right.
greater retention or
Right.
treatment or
Right.
what have you.
Right.
There's one other potential wrinkle down the road that I think is only peripherally addressed in this. It has to do with the possibility of storm surges. So if sea levels were to rise, another few feet by 2050 or 2070 are the two dates that you often hear quoted. Would there be the possibility of a storm surge topping over the Amelia Earhart Dam, bringing salt water flooding into the entire Mystic River Basin, up the Alewife Brook,
And then
and
getting into
right, and then you actually have an additional problem that it's not just fresh water infiltrating into basements and utilities. It's salt water and pretty much will wipe out a lot of your electrical works.
But I thought there isn't going to be that stuff under
Well,
there.
so to me, there are some. There's no question. There's some good ideas in here.
Yeah.
Whether it should all be part of zoning is something I still question because
Zoning's not the answer to everything.
Yeah. There are things like building codes, and maybe building codes need to be upgraded or made more specific to flood-prone areas.
But I thought you're implying that there is that there in some of those.
Some are already in there, but the thing
Yeah.
is that I'm not convinced that doing this via zoning is really the best
Right, but
overall
I'm
way
just
to do
saying,
this.
if you do it through the building codes, and you're getting to the same issues. You can only do what it allows you to do.
I just think it's sort of a better place to put it.
Yeah.
But and building codes are codes. It says this is the rules of what should be. If you do something where you basically say, well, we want to do something, we got to seek a special permit, and then everything is sort of negotiable. That's a little bit different than the way when you go to get your building permit, and they sort of say you can't do this, you can't do that because it's not up to code or it is up to code. I mean, if you say, well, I'd like to build this building, but I don't want to build it up to code, they say, well, sorry, tough, right? Whereas if you do it via special permit, you say, well, the codes say we want to do it this way here, but everything is negotiable. Then that's a little bit different.
Right.
Kind of so anyway, it's interesting, and I've said before that to me this is really two petitions rolled into one. I think that the planning board would be wise and the city council would be wise if they actually treated the two parts separately. One is to basically say what is appropriate for the future of the Alewife area, right? And that sort of flood zone. And then there's the second part, which is the one that's citywide, that wants to establish standards about what they call a green factor, different kinds of ways of calculating what the minimum amount of open space would be, which is kind of separate from the more specific flood zone area of Alewife. So, I've never been a big fan of doing trying to roll too many things into a zoning petition. But yeah, this is what it does. Anyway, I think it's got a certain amount of popular support. I'm not yet.
There's going to be a lot of people tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm not yet convinced that it necessarily has adequate support to be passed as is. I think there's still a lot of uneasiness from if you look at the people who sponsored this petition, you see, sort of Association of Cambridge Neighborhoods, Cambridge Residents Alliance. You don't see the pro-housing groups like A Better Cambridge, even though there seems to be a nod to the housing, so that it, in theory, isn't supposed to thwart the development of housing and specifically affordable housing. But I don't know that the people who are pro-housing are convinced of that, because it does thwart the ability to develop properties. And if you thwart the ability to develop properties, you implicitly thwart the ability to build housing. So there may be some folks from the Better Cambridge side of the coin who will be coming out speaking against it.
It'd be the same group that came the first time it was all in front of the council.
Yeah, but if there's one thing I think we learned from the Barrett petitions, Central Square Restoration petition, and the previous one about accessory apartments.
That's coming up again too.
Yeah, but the best way to get a serious zoning reform is to actually get the support of you know, to whatever degree there are two sides, and I don't personally
Mhm.
subscribe to that point of view, but
get a
but at least
a
get some
consensus
consensus of them
exactly.
all, and
Well, wouldn't that be great?
yeah,
Just in general.
wouldn't it be great, right?
in
But I think
Congress,
we're kind of in this
Yeah.
situation right
Yeah.
now that if you don't at least get some consensus building established here,
Yeah, that one.
amongst
I mean,
the-
it probably councils be reluctant to really.
yeah,
go
I mean,
forward with
well,
that.
the thing is, they certainly have plenty of basis for which to object to substantial parts of
Mhm.
it, based on the arguments from one side or the other.
Yeah.
You know, so we'll see how it plays out. You know, but anyway, that's the big item this week, honestly.
And that is the hearing is
plan-
tomorrow.
The planning board
at
is tonight,
5:30.
starting
the planning
at
board,
6:30.
but the
And
ordinance
the ordinance
committee
committee
meeting
is
is tomorrow,
tomorrow
and
at
it is
5:30.
televised, so you can stream it live on your
Right.
computer, or if you have cable TV.
Yeah. So
or
that's
go to the council.
that's the big stuff.
Yeah.
Now it's worth mentioning, and maybe we'll
Mhm.
talk a little more in the next half hour
Yeah.
about it. That there were actually, you know, the lonely little Nakagawa Brown petition now
Yeah.
has 3 other zoning petitions to keep it company.
Yeah, but that's
Well,
we'll,
what-
we'll mention that. We can.
Yeah.
One was intriguing to me because of who spoke about it.
Which one? Oh, and George
New
Bacharach?
Street, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Who was the environmental league
Yeah.
president or
Just
something?
I'll just give the list. The list is
Yeah.
there's one on New
Yeah.
Street that I think, if I got it right,
It's
wants
for
to
a
turn
storage
a
facility.
turn what's currently acting as a gym into like a self-storage place. Seems like a
you
even
mean the
trade.
the gym gymnastics place? That's what.
I think that's right. Which
That
is
isn't that whole industrial area. What's
there
the
are-
big deal?
it shouldn't be a big deal, but you
Okay.
never know because somebody will say, well, if you're doing that, why shouldn't you do this instead?
But why does it need an overlay district? I thought we
Well,
haven't
that one's
decided.
that's
what
unrelated to.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I don't know how it's actually
All right,
called, but
well,
it's something in the vicinity of New Street.
yeah,
There's there's another one having to do with accessory apartments. So
right, which I thought was settled, but I guess it's
The-
defining it,
These are
putting in some more language.
things that maybe
Or
should have
actually
been part of
including
the
it,
previous
right.
one, but this is an amendment to that amendment in a way.
Who put that in?
And then there's the one from Craig Kelly having to do with rainwater and flat roofs.
Oh, okay.
So-
All right. Well, we'll kind of look
So
at that and
anyway.
some other things that came up.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll be back in a few minutes.
Okay.
Cambridge Inside Out.
See you then.